So in part two, we're going to look at doing a similar process, but with a RESTful API, and introduce you a little bit to RESTful APIs here. So rather than trying to read from a file, that's just not actually very common. So we're going to use RESTful APIs. We talked about some of the architectures. RESTful APIs are often done with these microservice architectures. We've had a couple of our guest speakers talk about them and using APIs. So thought we should be bringing a little bit more into this course. So I've changed this assignment this year into to bring these in. So we're going to do another request. As a trader, I want to be able to read trades from a new RESTful API so I can add trades from different apps. So again, maybe we have something else that's pushing data into this RESTful API, and then we're taking it from this. And again, we're doing test-driven design. We have this RESTful API test. So if we go over here and look at our tests here, there's a RESTful API test here, and it just creates a RESTful API and it uses a URL. Then we just call get trade data with that, getting data from that. And we just check, we count how many trades. So we're just getting an array of strings, a list of strings here. So we're not actually parsing, we're just seeing if we can actually read it. So we're just counting how many lines are in this. So we have a little method. Now we have an IEnumeral type, and there's no way to get to the count of that directly. We could be using iCollection or some other method, but this is what the textbook uses. So to do this test, I actually have a little loop just to loop through and count how many strings we get from that, and we compare it to how many strings we think we should get from it. So right now when we run our tests, that fails. So RESTful API, this test fails here. And the reason it fails is that we're not doing anything in our RESTful API really. So if we open up our RESTful trade provider, nothing's implemented there. We have a constructor and we don't even save that. So we're going to go through the same thing that we did in the previous one here. So your job is to modify the RESTful trade API and do it and work on that. So okay, I had to update. I'd forgotten to reload this page, so it didn't have the newest version of this. So, and so your job is to modify the RESTful trade provider. I'm just going to walk you through that. And here's a full version of that code that we're going to look at, but we're going to take it apart bit by bit and see. So this is a version of RESTful trade data provider. And at the heart of it is this one method that gets the data from a RESTful service. So we're just going to copy that data out and paste it in here. So again, after the constructor, but before this get trade data, I'm going to paste in this data. So let's just walk through. And so your job is, you might want to pause this and see if you can get this to work now. What you want to do is make sure you're saving this URL and this logger locally, and see if you can get this part of the data work. And I'll just, if you don't want to pause, I'll just walk through here. So just like the last one, URL one, we're going to pass in the parameters here and save those to local variables. So I'm going to just make sure, I'm just going to copy and paste that in here. And I'm going to need some local variables. I don't have any at the bottom of here of my class. I'm just going to grab my local variables that I need and stick them in here. Okay, so I'm constructor passes in a URL and a logger, and I save those locally. Now I call this get product async. It uses asynchronous tasks. Now in the next unit, we're going to actually look at adding async as a decorator, and that's why in the first file one I didn't do asynchronous. Now generally you would never do something like that without doing asynchronous, but we wanted to be able to add it as a decorator next unit. But to process this, this uses this new HTTP client, and we have to do that asynchronously. There's just no way to avoid it. So we're going to make sure we bring in our threading here. So using system threading tasks, so that task is defined here. client is something we're going to declare as a local variable. So I'm going to go back to this code also and get this client and add that. So we're going to use this HTTP client. I'm going to add one of those down at the bottom of the screen here. So HTTP client here, and we're going to bring that in. So that's systemnet.http for this. Okay, so that should take care of our errors. So we imported HTTP net system.net.http and the thread task stuff. Okay, so that's what we have up there. Now we don't have any errors in this stuff. Now, just so you note, this uses two NuGet packages. So let's walk through and see what this is. First, it just logs it and says connecting to a RESTful HTTP server, use HTTP. I'm actually going to maybe put in the URL here that we're connecting to, and URL. And I'm just going to add in the URL and print that out also so you can see that. Okay, so again, this does what a lot of the other ones does. We're going to loop through a data source and then set up a set of trade. Well, actually, this one we don't have to loop through, but we're going to define a list of strings called our trade strings. We're going to set that equal to null initially here. And now we're going to get this, run this task here, and get some asynchronous data and wait for that task to finish up. And then we're going to get that results here. So again, how asynchronous tasks goes, this was returning a list of strings, but it's doing it asynchronously. So it's inside a task environment. So we wrap it in a task. And so we execute that task, we wait for that task to get done, and then we get that result. So the result is always the result of the task. And when we tell our task to run, we run something. And here we're telling the client, this HTTP client, to go out, get asynchronously from this URL here. So that gets the data from that URL and saves it as a response. And now this is a whole HTTP response. It has a set structure. It returns a response code, either like 404, which is like an error, site not found, or like 200, I believe, is success. So we're going to check if that response is a success code. There's actually a number of successful codes, if I remember correctly. So it checks if that's successful. If it is, then we're going to process it and read it asynchronously also. We are given a JSON file, which is this result. So if we look at, let's look at this, let's look at program. Here's the URL we're using for our RESTful stuff. So we're going out to this URL and we're getting our data. So this is a RESTful API server, and we'll look at this server in a little bit, but it's returning this, and this is actually a JSON file, and this is actually an API, and I can actually specify, I could just grab, if I wanted the first of these values or the second, or I mean, either any of these values through this interface by specifying index, and we'll see how that works later on. Or if I just say get it all, it'll return this. And this is a JSON file, which is for a string, an array, or list of strings. So that's what this is. It's returning that. So that's what we're getting here, is a list of strings here, but it comes as a JSON file, and we have to what we call serialize that, convert that, or I mean deserialize it, convert it from a string, a JSON file, into an actual C# structure, which is a list of strings. We used to have to do that stuff manually. Nowadays, we can do that automatically. So this code automatically does this. Now this uses a couple libraries here that we've brought in. So if you look under dependencies and look under NuGet packages, just to get the HTTP stuff requires this package. And then to do the JSON parsing automatically, we use this newtonsoft.json package. Microsoft tutorials use both of those, so we're using the same ones here. So those are processed in here. So I put a little comment here that those are the two NuGet packages that are required for this section. But you shouldn't have to worry about those. Those should be imported automatically when you bring in this project. So, okay, we bring in our information here, and again, we don't have to loop through it. We can just grab this all the trades at once, converts it into a list of trade data, and then we can return that here. So now in our code here, we've done this code. Now we're just going to put this in get trades here. This is our information in get trades. So rather than doing this exception here, we're going to get rid of that exception and put in this code from the example here, where we're going to run an asynchronous task here. Now, right now we're passing in a string in here, and this was a leftover mistake here. So we actually don't use, see that the path is not used. We are actually using the URL up here from the constructor. That's what we're using. So we don't need this path. So we're going to get rid of this path here. And same here, when we call this, we don't need to specify a URL. We're doing that somewhere else. We're passing that into the constructor here. Also from the tutorial, I noticed this is called get product async. And I want to rename that to get trade. I forgot to do that. So I'm just going to rename that and type in get trade async. Apply that. Okay. And that'll do it here also. Okay, so that's a better name for that method. Okay. So again, this runs get trades asynchronous, waits for the results. The results should come back as this task list. We a task, and we get the results of it. That should be our trade file, and we're just returning that trade file here. Now I'm just going to do a quick thing. I actually made this overly complicated, so we could actually simplify this. We don't have to be doing this quite this way. So I'm just going to quickly simplify this and explain what we're going to do. I was trying to remove the synchronous stuff from here or do some work with this, but again, I found out I couldn't, and I see some remnant code in here. So I'm actually going to switch the comments. I'm going to comment out these lines that are doing some of this, have a task up here. We really don't need that task, and just do this line that was commented out there. So we're just going to do get our response that way, and call get async here for this. And then I actually don't need these lines, so I'm just going to delete those. So this is a maybe easier to read version of this. So we declare our trade string here. We then just go to our client and call get async with our path, and this should be actually URL here. We're going to get our URL here. Then we check our response that we got from that and see if we're successful, if we got a 200 response back from the HTTP server. And if so, then we do another conversion of that response into a list of strings here. So we read that into a list of strings, and that gives us our trade strings, and we just return those trade strings. So this uses this await stuff, and that makes this what is called an asynchronous task. We'll maybe talk more about that later, but that this makes it an asynchronous task here, this whole thing. So now to call this, I can't call this directly. If I do, then I have to make this an asynchronous task there. So to call this get produce asynchronous, I do it inside a task. So I say task run, and I call this asynchronous task. I wait for it to be done, and then I can get the results from that, and that'll give us this. So I just wanted to clear that up a little bit. Okay, onward. So now, hopefully this will work here. We can save this. We can run our tests here. So let's bring up our test world and check our tests. So this RESTful test was failing, and hopefully it will succeed now. It should go out to that RESTful API and grab it correctly. So now that's working here. So the only tests are failing is the validation tests. And again, we're fixing those in the assignment. So that's look good. Now if I run this, it actually isn't running quite correctly. It is still using the getting trade from this file here, not from the RESTful API. So what do I have to do to change that? I have to go back to my main program here, open up my main program. And again, I declare these different data providers here. A file data provider reads a local file, a URL trade provider, and a RESTful provider. And then depending on which one I want to use, I pass the one I want to use to trade processor to say use that. And so I have to change this to use the RESTful trade provider. So now it should be using this. So you can also see which ones are grayed, those aren't being used, and the one that's not grayed is being used. And now it's using the RESTful provider. So now if I run this, I'll bring this back at screen here, it's saying connecting to a RESTful server using and this address, and it does our 3 trades. Okay, so that works. So everything is done here. So we are good with this assignment. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how this RESTful API works, what the server looks like. So I'm going to open up this link here. And this is just a simple RESTful provider. So I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to open up a whole separate version of Visual Studio. So I'm going to run Visual Studio off to the side here so I can have another window of it. Okay, so it's opening up another window of Visual Studio. It's putting it over here. Let's bring it over here. And I'm going to clone that repository there and open it up. Let's see where that's going to go. That's over here. Okay, so now I have this other one. Now I'll just show you how I created this. Just, I created a new project. Switch this to a web project, and there's actually an API option here. So I went down and chose a different versions that are called slightly different. So this is ASP.NET Core Web API. So this again, controller for RESTful HTTP services here. So I created that here. And then you can give it a name and stuff and set that up. And it just do an empty process. It sets up these controllers, and by default, it just has this sample weather controller in it. And then I can run this on here. So if you remember, controllers kind of control what web pages we can see here. And this one doesn't have views because the controllers push all the data we need. We don't need views for this. So now I'm going to run this. It'll open up a web server and display it here, localhost, and by default it's going to this weather forecast here and displaying some weather data. And again, this is a JSON file that's displaying for that. Now, I'm going to, let's see, switch back here, show you that there's also these other controllers. So I have a trade data controller here, and that creates a trade list, a list of strings, and in the constructor it just adds strings to this list. So we create a list of strings for the trades, and then it has these different controllers, one for get and one for get with an ID. Now there's also some post and deletes and other things. I don't have those here, so you can just read data from this API. You can't do anything else. Can't add data to it currently. But I create my trade lists here, instantiate, and then it just returns that trade list. So it returns a list of strings, actually an IEnumerable, an uneditable list of strings here. Now, the other option is to get with an ID. If I specify an ID, it just returns that one trade list item. So whatever item in that index into that list that you specify an ID here. One thing to note is that the route here defines how this is. So this is going to be the localhost / API / and then the controller name. And the controller name here is, let's see what it's called, trade data controller. So I don't need the word controller there, just trade data. So now if I go back to my web page here, here's my localhost. And so instead of weather forecast, if I do API / trade data, that's all my trade data, and I'm running on the local host. And in fact, I can get individual items there also by calling that. And again, that will, if I just do trade data, that does this get and returns a string, a list of strings. If I just still get with an ID, it just returns a single string, not a list of strings for this. Now, I can actually use this local, if I leave this localhost running here with this URL, I'm going to copy that URL because this often the port number is a little different each time. And if I switch to my other version of Visual Studio and go up here and use this local host here and switch which URL I'm using for this, it'll now be using this local URL. In fact, I can go in here and I could, rather than doing 3 trades, my other one's doing the same 3 trades. Let's do 2 trades. I'm going to comment one of those out here. Let's stop this and run it again. So because that's in the constructor, we'll run this again with only 2 trades here. Okay. So again, it should be going to API.trade data and getting those 2 trades. So if I run this here with that local trade data. So again, I'm running a web server on one Visual Studio and then a web consumer on another one. So I'm consuming these, or these RESTful API. So again, 2 trades, and it gets those 2 trades from, again, the local host here. So I just want to show you that you can do that. Now, how do we put that out there to run not on a local server? So let's just go over that real quickly because, again, I just thought it might be nice to look at some of this cloud-based stuff here. So if I go to Azure, Microsoft, and I log in there, and I go to all their services, they have a bunch of web services here for this. So networking, storage, web here, different things. But this is an app service. It runs this sort of API in a little app here, serverless app, and so that's what it is. So when to create this, I actually hit create here. Created this. Now you need to have a subscription level and a resource group, and again, this is where your credit card is tied in. So I've got my credit card tied in there. Give it some name, and then this name is what's added here. And again, it has to be unique. So like trade record or create API are all taken. So I ended up using like unit 9. So again, lots of these are already taken in this domain. So you have to find a unique one here. And then we just run code. We don't need it in a Docker or anything like that. Runtime stack, I was just running the same core environment we used before in our system, running on Windows Central. And again, there's a free level of this. There's different levels. I've switched this to a development level, and it's so free. So you can actually set this up and run it free here. So there's no charge for this level of service here. And then you can display different things. Now, one thing that's nice is under deployment, I can tie in my GitHub account. So now if I'm in GitHub or if I'm even in Visual Studio and I make some changes here, I push those are automatically pushed up to GitHub, and then this grabs them from GitHub automatically. The rest of this stuff you really don't have to do. You can just create this web service and it'll tell you what the URL for it. So here's our web service here, and here's our URL we use for that. So that's how I got that. So that's how I set it up here. So it's not that complicated to set this all up and run this here. So back to our learning activity. So we've finished this up. I'll have the assignment ready. So again, we've hopefully seen that we can relatively easily change our program, we can just, because we have these interfaces, we can declare different types of data providers and just swap them in. And because we're using what's called dependency injection, where we're sending the constructor the things we want, we can just pass in our different providers, whatever provider we want, we have to change it. So we don't have to change any of the code. We don't even have to change trade processor that uses it. We're just sending it. It just expects something of this interface type here, and we can send anything there. All the changes are either in the main program or in the code that we wanted, that we're changing or adding. So, okay, that's it for today.